I'd rented dozens of Airbnbs over the years, but nothing could have prepared me for what happened last winter. I'd found a small cabin tucked away in the woods of upstate New York, the kind that oozes rustic charm and seemed perfect for a weekend escape. The listing had a handful of reviews, all glowing, mentioning the cozy feel and scenic views. It was just what I needed after a long week. I arrived late Friday night. The drive was dark and winding, and my GPS barely held on as I navigated the final stretch of road. When I pulled up to the cabin, it looked just like the pictures. Wooden, charming, and almost idyllic. I messaged the host, Mark, to let him know I'd arrived, and he quickly replied, welcoming me and mentioning that the key was under the mat. I stepped inside, shaking off the chill. The interior was just as inviting as the photos, with a rustic fireplace, a little couch, and an old-fashioned kitchen. It had a lived-in feel that made it seem like someone could have been there just moments before me. But, for some reason, I felt watched. I brushed it off as nerves. I was alone in an unfamiliar place after all. Unpacking, I realized that the entire cabin was surprisingly outfitted with vintage furniture, which only added to its charm. But I also noticed a few oddities. The mirrors. They were everywhere. In the kitchen, in the hallway, even above the fireplace, which seemed unusual. And then there was the largest one, hanging directly across from the bed in the single bedroom. After some time by the fire, I went to bed. It was strange, lying there with the big mirror facing me. I couldn't help but feel like I was being watched, like the room was waiting for something. I tried to ignore it, pulling the covers up to my chin and drifting off. Around 3 a.m., I woke up to a creak. The sound was distinct and close, like footsteps just outside the bedroom door. I held my breath, straining to listen, but the cabin was silent again. I was tempted to get up, but something kept me pinned to the bed, an icy feeling in my chest. Then, I heard it, a faint whisper, just barely audible. I sat up, looking around the room. My eyes fell on the mirror across from the bed. My reflection was there, of course, but as I stared, something seemed wrong. My reflection was smiling. I jolted, scrambling backward on the bed. The grin on my face, on my reflection's face, was unmistakable. I turned away, afraid that if I looked back, it would still be grinning at me. I was trapped between the disbelief and raw terror, trying to convince myself it was just a trick of the light. For the rest of the night, I kept my back to the mirror, barely able to sleep. I heard soft tapping sounds and the occasional creak, but I didn't dare turn to check the mirror. When dawn finally broke, I felt a wave of relief. In the light, things would feel normal again, or so I thought. The next morning, I searched the cabin. I wanted an explanation, maybe a loose floorboard or a draft that could explain the strange sounds. But everything seemed perfectly normal. I messaged Mark, asking if he'd ever noticed anything strange in the cabin, hoping for some kind of reassurance. But he replied quickly, saying he'd never had any issues before. I spent the day in town, finding excuses to avoid the cabin until it was nearly dark again. I dreaded the idea of sleeping there for another night, but with no other options, I returned. I kept all the lights on, hoping it would keep the shadows at bay. That night, as I lay there, I tried to avoid looking at the mirror. I kept my eyes fixed on the ceiling, but the silence pressed in on me. At some point, my curiosity got the better of me, and I glanced over. My reflection was there, staring back, but something was different. This time, it looked blurry, like a haze was distorting my face. I leaned forward to get a better look. That's when I noticed my reflection's hand wasn't on the bed like mine. It was reaching out, as if pressing against the glass, as if trying to escape. I jumped out of bed, yanking the mirror off the wall in a panic. Behind it, etched into the wall, were words scratched deeply into the wood. "Help me. Don't trust the mirror." I stumbled back, my pulse racing, and in that instant, the power went out. Plunged into darkness, I scrambled for my phone to find some light. As the flashlight flickered on, the cabin felt oppressive, like the walls were closing in. I needed to leave now. I rushed to the door, only to hear a voice, soft and close, whispering right behind me, "Stay with me." I bolted, sprinting to my car without a second glance. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away. Only when I was back in town did I dare to look in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something, or someone, sitting in the back seat. But it was just me, my pale face staring back, wide-eyed and shaken. I reported the incident to Airbnb, and they promised to look into it. But a few days later, I checked the listing, and it was still there. The cabin looked the same, cozy and inviting, with all its 5-star reviews intact. To this day, I can't look at a mirror without feeling a shadow of that fear, that lurking sense that something on the other side is watching, waiting for me to look back. When I booked an Airbnb for a weekend getaway, I never expected it would become the worst decision of my life. It was a charming house in a quiet mountain town, owned by a woman named Lily. The photos showed a quaint cottage with white shutters, a well-kept garden, and cozy, rustic decor. It was perfect for a weekend of relaxation and solitude. I arrived late in the evening after a grueling drive, and Lily wasn't there to greet me. She'd left a key under a flower pot on the porch, which I found with little effort. The moment I opened the door, a strange smell hit me. It wasn't entirely foul, just odd, like damp wood mixed with something metallic. Shrugging it off as the scent of an old house, I set my bags down in the hallway and looked around. The cottage was as lovely as advertised, maybe even more so. The living room had a large stone fireplace, and a throw blanket draped over the couch, like a scene out of a storybook. I quickly made my way to the master bedroom, grateful to finally rest. But as I walked down the narrow hallway, something caught my eye, a door at the end of the hall. It wasn't mentioned in the listing photos or description. I figured it was a closet or a utility room and didn't think much of it at first, but as I walked past, I heard something. Faint scratching sounds, almost like nails scraping on wood. I froze, staring at the door. The sound stopped, and I dismissed it as my imagination. I was tired, after all. Later that night, as I lay in bed scrolling through my phone, I heard it again. This time, it was louder, a scraping and shuffling, like something moving behind that door. Curiosity got the better of me. I crept out of bed, phone flashlight in hand, and approached the door. I pressed my ear to it, holding my breath. First, there was nothing. Then, a muffled whisper. My stomach turned, and I stumbled back, dropping my phone. The whisper was low, almost inaudible, like someone was right on the other side. "Help me." My blood ran cold. Every instinct told me to leave, but I couldn't bring myself to move. Gathering my courage, I gripped the doorknob and turned it. Locked. I fumbled around, noticing a small brass key hanging on a hook by the hallway's end. Without thinking, I grabbed it, unlocked the door, and swung it open. The room was pitch black. My flashlight illuminated only a small section, showing me a dusty floor, cobwebbed corners, and nothing else. But the smell was stronger here, sour and pungent, like something rotting. As I turned to close the door, I saw something in the corner of my eye. A figure, small and hunched, with hollow eyes that seemed to look right through me. My heart pounded as I blinked, and the figure was gone. I slammed the door shut, heart racing, and rushed back to my room, locking the door behind me. I didn't sleep that night. The scratching and whispering continued, soft but constant, echoing through the walls. At dawn, I decided I'd had enough. I packed my things and practically sprinted to my car, vowing to leave a scathing review. As I drove away, my phone buzzed. It was a message from Lily. "Hope you enjoyed your stay. Just a heads up, don't try to open the door at the end of the hall. It's been permanently sealed since an incident with a former guest." I stared at my phone, chills crawling up my spine. It hit me then. How could the door be sealed if I'd opened it? And what was that figure in the darkness? To this day, I can't shake the feeling that something followed me from that house. Every now and then, in the quiet of the night, I hear faint whispers and the sound of nails scraping on wood. I was looking for a unique getaway, something off the beaten path. When I found an Airbnb listing for a charming cottage near an old graveyard, I thought it would be an interesting experience. The host's description was inviting, and the photos showed a cozy, well-kept place. I booked it without a second thought. The drive to the cottage was uneventful, but as I got closer, the atmosphere changed. The road became narrower, flanked by dense woods that seemed to close in on me. By the time I arrived, the sun was setting, casting long shadows over the gravestones that dotted the landscape around the cottage. The host, an elderly man named Mr. Thompson, greeted me with a warm smile. He handed me the keys and gave me a brief tour, pointing out the amenities and warning me to stay away from the graveyard at night. "It's not safe," he said, his eyes darkening. I laughed it off, thinking he was just trying to add to the spooky ambience. The first night was peaceful. I enjoyed a quiet evening by the fireplace, reading a book and sipping on tea. But as the night wore on, I started to hear strange noises, soft whispers and the sound of footsteps outside. I dismissed them as my imagination and went to bed. Around midnight, I was jolted awake by a loud bang. My heart raced as I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight. The room was empty, but the air felt heavy, oppressive. I heard the footsteps again, this time coming from the hallway. I got up and slowly opened the door, shining the light into the darkness. The hallway was empty, but the whispers grew louder, more insistent. I followed the sound to the living room, where I found the front door wide open. A cold breeze blew in, sending shivers down my spine. I closed the door and locked it, trying to shake off the feeling of unease. The next day, I decided to explore the graveyard. The tombstones were old and weathered, some dating back to the 1800s. As I wandered among the graves, I felt a strange sense of being watched. I turned around, but there was no one there. The feeling of unease grew stronger, and I decided to head back to the cottage. That night, the disturbances intensified. I heard scratching at the windows and the sound of something heavy being dragged across the floor. I tried to ignore it, but the noises became impossible to ignore. I got up and walked to the living room, where I found a trail of dirt leading from the front door to the basement. My curiosity got the better of me and I followed the trail. The basement door was ajar, and as I descended the stairs, the air grew colder. The basement was dark and musty, filled with old furniture and boxes. In the corner, I saw a figure hunched over, its back to me. I called out, but the figure didn't move. I took a step closer, and the figure slowly turned around. It was a woman, her face pale and gaunt, her eyes hollow and lifeless. She opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. Instead, she pointed to a small door at the back of the basement. I hesitated, but something compelled me to open the door. Inside, I found a small room filled with old photographs and letters. The photos showed Mr. Thompson with the woman, who I assumed was his wife. The letters spoke of a tragic accident that had claimed her life and how Mr. Thompson had been trying to communicate with her ever since. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind me, and the room grew dark. The whispers returned, louder and more frantic. I felt a cold hand on my shoulder, and I turned to see the woman standing right behind me. Her eyes were filled with sorrow, and she whispered, "Help me." I bolted for the door, but it wouldn't budge. The whispers turned into screams, and I felt hands grabbing at me from the darkness. In a desperate attempt to escape, I kicked the door open and ran up the stairs, not stopping until I was outside. I jumped into my car and sped away, not daring to look back. When I reported the incident to Airbnb, they told me there was no listing at that address and no host by the name of Mr. Thompson. I later discovered that the cottage had been abandoned for years, ever since Mr. Thompson had died in a fire. To this day, I can't explain what happened. All I know is that some places hold onto their ghosts, and I was lucky to escape with my life.